Today, Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt were sentenced, and post-traumatic parents and post-traumatic people have a lot of thoughts about this entire case. Are you a post-traumatic person? Have you been following this case with a lot of interest? Has this case been triggering you? Welcome. That's what we're going to talk about today. So click subscribe below so you never miss another episode as we unpack why this case has been so attention grabbing for post-traumatic people and post-traumatic parents everywhere. And let's understand and unpack some of the sentencing around this case. So today, Ruby Franke, the vlogger, the YouTuber from the 8 Passengers channel, was sentenced by a judge to 4 consecutive counts of, I believe it was aggravated child abuse. Each count carries with it a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 15 years. The judge today assigned consecutive sentences, which means not concurrent, which means that those sentences will be one after another. So that would be up to between 4 years and up to 30 years. It should be 60, but Utah has a 30-year cap on their sentencing. So it's going to be anywhere between 4 and 30 years. Jodi Hildebrandt as well was sentenced today to the same. And we're going to talk about each of their pleas, and we're going to talk about what the judge said to them. So I first want to talk about Jodi Hildebrandt simply because my reaction to Ruby Franke is dependent on what I think of Jodi. So even though Ruby pled first, and even though Ruby spoke much more in court, I really want to talk about what Jodi said, because I want to talk about the different levels of culpability in this case. So Jodi got up in court and she said that she has a lot of remorse for what she did. She said that she loves the Franke children, and that's why she chose to plead guilty rather than go through a trial, because she wanted to spare them a trial.
I sincerely love these children. I desire for them to heal physically and emotionally. One of the reasons I did not go to trial is that I did not want them to emotionally relive the experience which would have been detrimental to them. My hope and prayer is that they will heal and move forward to have beautiful lives. I am willing to submit to what the state feels would be an appropriate amount of time served to make retribution.
I do not believe this at all. I have a very hard time believing what she is saying, simply because I think the real reason that Jodi pled guilty is that there is no defense for what she did. There is nothing she could possibly say in court that is consistent with the law of this land, or even with the law of common sense, that would ever justify duct taping, starving, abusing, forcing children to work as if they're in some, prison gang where they have to work in the backyard of the house with no shoes, no socks, no protection from the sun, and no water in blistering heat. There is no excuse for that. There is no reason or justification in the world other than insanity, which she is not pleading, that could ever explain doing something like that. The prosecutor seemed to feel like this was religious extremism taken to extreme levels, because that's what he said, that she felt she had a direct line to God, and she felt like she was doing this out of some religious moral imperative. I have a hard time entirely buying that, only because in Ruby's case, it seems like she was mistreating these children before she even met Jodi. But leaving that aside, I think the real reason why Jodi pled guilty is nothing to do with her love of these children, has to do with there's nothing you can say to defend this. So don't bother. So and don't bother, because all you can do is claim, here, I'm being so nice now, I'm not putting the kids through the trauma of a trial. In actuality, putting the kids through the trauma of a trial might not be so traumatic for the kids. I've worked with many trauma survivors who, as part of their Justice Department involvement, had to face an accuser in open court, speak to a detective, speak to all manner of official people about the abuse they endured. And many of them found that healing and they found that empowering. Getting up in open court and facing down an abuser and saying, this is how you harmed me and it wasn't okay, can be incredibly empowering and healing. It has to be processed. It has to be really handled well therapeutically before, during the process, and after. But it can be a really empowering experience. It can be a way of taking power away from an abuser when you can stand up in court and say, you did that to me and it wasn't okay. So I'm not sure it's her love for them that's stopping her from, that's, helping her shield them from the trauma of a trial. I think that handled well, the trauma of a trial might have been actually quite helpful to them. But I don't know them, of course. I'm not their mental health professional. I don't know any of that. But this concern that she has, that she wants to spare them the trauma of a trial, is a little spurious to me. I don't know. I'm really not buying it. I think for many post-traumatic parents, I've been getting so many DMs and emails about this case. I think what was very triggering were the words, I love these children.
I sincerely love these children.
So many post-traumatic parents were abused in the name of love. I love you, so I'm hitting you. I love you, so I am taking this important thing away from you. I love you, so I'm calling you these horrible names. I love you, so I'm fat shaming you. I love you, so I'm telling you what a lazy, horrible idiot you are. I love you, so I'm telling you that you're going to go to hell, right? A lot of post-traumatic parents were told that abuse was love. And then we become adults and we're told that the job of a parent is to love their child, whether we're parenting real world children or our own inner children. We're told that adults love children. But what's love? If someone told you as they're beating you, I love you, that's why I'm beating you. I had a patient who told me that when her father would beat her, after he beat her, she would have to kiss his hand and thank him for beating her. So, and tell him how much she feels loved by the fact that he beat her. So love is a very loaded concept, right? Now, as an adult, love is a very loaded concept. What does love mean? Love means beating people, but I don't want to beat my kids. But maybe I'm supposed to beat my kids. What do I do when they're being difficult? What do I do when they're doing something dangerous? What do I do when they're acting loud the way I was loud? Maybe some guy will come and beat them the way my dad beat me, right? So love becomes very confusing for post-traumatic parents, for post-traumatic people, because so many post-traumatic parents were told all sorts of odd and bizarre reasons why they were being hurt. So for Jodi to say, I love those children, it's just so triggering for so many of us. And here's another thing. The judge said something very interesting to Jodi that I think is very true. And it goes to this statement of love.
This circumstance is tragic. It's largely, of course, of your making. By any measure, your conduct in this case was disastrous for these children. Adults are supposed to protect children. Adults with specialized training in particular are supposed to protect children. You didn't do that in this case. In this case, you terrorized children, and the results have been tragic. It's what happened to these children and your philosophy in dealing with them, frankly, seems detached from reality or any objective standard of decency or even common sense.
The judge said to her, he basically said to her, you have a moral imperative as an adult to care for and protect children. Like all adults should care for the children around them, right? That's our job as adults. We're supposed to protect the kids. And that's just the moral job of every member of the human race. On top of that, you had the ethical imperative and the fiduciary duty of care towards children, minor children, that you were supposed to be the mental health professional for. So both as a professional and as a basic human, you failed. That's really what the judge was saying. Jodi, your job was not to love those children. Your job was to provide a duty of care to those children. Your job was to provide treatment to those children. You weren't being paid to love them. You were being paid to use your professional and ethical discernment and judgment, your knowledge of child development that you acquired during your mental health counseling program, your knowledge of counseling practices and best practices to help them. You were not being paid to love them. And I think that love is a very twisted concept to you, and I'm sorry for that. I think Jodi might be a post-traumatic person who didn't integrate her traumas and really internalize the message that abuse is love. Abuse is not love. So I think for a lot of us, hearing Jodi say that she loved those children was very triggering, and it makes a lot of sense. Now let's go to Ruby. So Ruby really, basically was blaming everything on Jodi, saying I was led down a dark path. I didn't have the ability to make my own choices.
I would like to make a statement without any intent to change my stipulated sentence. For the past 4 years, I've chosen to follow counsel and guidance that has led me into a dark delusion. My distorted version of reality went largely unchecked, as I would isolate from anyone who challenged me. I was led to believe that this world was an evil place, filled with cops who control, hospitals that injure, government agencies that brainwash, church leaders who lie and lust, husbands who refuse to protect, and children who need abused.
It's very hard to know how to take that, because Ruby was posting problematic content about raising her children before she met Jodi. She seemed to really relish her children's discomfort in a way that was deeply disturbing before Jodi, and then at the beginnings of Jodi, when Jodi hadn't had a chance to brainwash her yet. And let's talk for a minute about causing children discomfort, because I think this is something that a lot of post-traumatic parents really struggle with. A lot of us are really good at the warmth of parenting, at the love. We know what we want to, we really, really know what we want to do. We want to be that warm, cozy, loving presence in our children's lives. Like, we know that stuff. But then what happens with the part of parenting that has to do with teaching children competencies for life, being that adult in the room who's smarter and who knows more about the world, and sometimes has to cause a child discomfort? This is where things get very confusing, right? Because if your kid has a splinter, you're going to have to hold them down, and you're going to have to use the tweezers or whatever and get that splinter out before it festers. Now, in the moment, you're causing your kid discomfort. And if you were raised by an abusive parent and you were told that abuse is love, and that being beaten is part of love, and that this is what, God wants, this is what the world wants, this is the right thing to do, then causing your child any form of pain is going to feel like you're being that abusive person. You're making your kid cry. But sometimes the adult has to do those things. Your kid gets stung by a bee, you got to take the stinger out. Sometimes your kid doesn't want to go take a bath, or they don't want to do their homework, or they don't want to eat their vegetables, they don't want to clean up their toys, right? There's a lot of things where we have to ask our children to tolerate a certain level of discomfort in service of a larger goal. And this is where that opens the door to abuse, because where's the line between, we're going to clean up the toys now, even though you don't want to, because that's part of being a citizen of a family and learning responsibility, and abusively doing that? And that can be so confusing. It can be confusing for all parents. And many parents cross the line, not because they're abusive, but simply because sometimes we run out of self-control. Our prefrontal cortex is overloaded. That's the seat of self-control. The kid is being particularly difficult right now. We're still the adult. We're still responsible to manage our own emotions. But, there's a lot going on. You've said the same thing 30 times over. You've had a hard, stressful day yourself. And then on top of that, sometimes our kids trigger us as post-traumatic parents. So if you're a people pleaser, or if you are somebody who has been ignored by important people in your life, then it's very easy for your inner child to want to lash out like, how can you make my day even harder? I had such a stressful day. My boss was mean to me, and then my car broke down, and then the milk was spoiled, and then the rice burned, and now I'm asking you to do your math homework. How many times do I have to ask you? Like, you're the next person who's not hearing me and making my day more stressful than it has to be. And it's just a little kid. She's not doing her math homework because, math's not fun when you're in third grade. So it's easy for post-traumatic parents to sometimes become triggered by our children. And what starts out as genuine concern for a child can turn into lashing out at someone causing me stress. And that line is very difficult sometimes to see. It takes a lot of discernment to see, wait, am I telling my child an important thing and forcing them to do something they don't want to do because I'm actually trying to teach a skill? And forcing probably is a little strong, right? But I'm getting them to do something they don't want to do because there's a legitimate reason, or because I don't want to lose a power struggle right now. Because if I don't want to lose a power struggle right now, that's about my inner child. Somewhere inside of me was an inner child who was constantly feeling like everybody else was riding roughshod over her, and now she's not going to lose. Like, that's not going to happen again. But our inner child can't parent our child. So we're often grappling with the balance between those two things. So, and that's why this case can be so confusing and so triggering for post-traumatic parents, because here you see somebody who was on that line and then veered sharply over it. And the question is when and why? Now, I posted a previous video about Ruby, and some people said I was giving her a pass on her behavior. I think it's important to understand that we can totally analyze how Ruby got from point A of, I'm going to have this wholesome family channel, and I'm going to show my adorable family full of absolutely beautiful children doing really cool and fun things together, to duct taping emaciated children, right? Like, how did you get from point A, saying some things about parenting that at first sounded relatively normal, and then slowly but surely getting darker and darker and darker until people were calling Child Protective Services, who did nothing, by the way, and until we're in criminal court? How did you get from point A to point Z? We can analyze those decisions. We can follow Ruby down that path and figure out how she got there without condoning her behavior. Because to understand it is to also understand ourselves, in the sense that, what are my blind spots? How could I go from a relatively good point A to a really bad point Z? Like, I could also make mistakes. I think some of the mistakes Ruby made was her YouTube channel felt like an echo chamber. There was an algorithm to satisfy, and that algorithm got hungrier, so she had to be more extreme in her views. And when you say extreme things, cognitive dissonance, which is this idea that our brain doesn't like to say A but do B. Our brain likes to be consistent. So I don't like to say, yeah, I think spanking kids is the best thing in the world to do. I don't, by the way, just to be clear. And then not spank my kids. So once I've said it and I've made that, and I've said it, and now I got lots of views and people are yelling at me on YouTube, and it's got controversy, so lots of people are logging on, so the algorithm's happy, then I need to be consistent and actually spank my kids because I said I spanked my kids, right? So those two things feed into each other. Or I spank my kids, therefore I need to shoot a video showing why it's great to spank kids. Cognitive dissonance makes us, especially when there's an algorithm involved, makes us get more and more and more and more extreme. One of the things I've learned from this case and other cases is I am staunchly committed to not showing my children's faces and having very minimal presence of my children on any of my social media. You'll occasionally see one of their hands. You'll occasionally hear one of their voices say something in the background of a video that I'm shooting, because like sometimes I'm shooting a video and my kids like exist, they're around. But you're never going to see my kids' faces. You're never going to hear me ask them questions that belong on the video. Like they're not being interviewed on a video, because I don't want an algorithm to subtly in any way influence how I parent my children. That's something I've learned from this case. But I think that it's important to see, how did she get from point A to point Z? Because she took a real dark turn. Now, according to her statement that she made in court, she seems to give Jodi a lot of culpability. And the truth is, as the professional, Jodi does have a little bit more culpability because it was her job to be the professional. On the other hand, Ruby was already making problematic choices before Jodi. Her ability to tolerate discomfort for her children, right? Her ability to say like, oh yeah, my kids are going to be uncomfortable and I'm fine with that, really feels to me like her inner child parenting her child. There was that one video where her daughter's teacher called, that her daughter was like a kindergartner, like maybe 5, 6 years old, and she had left her lunch at home. And Ruby said to the teacher, well, I'm not driving all over the school and bringing her lunch. And now Ruby later explained that, the school is 40 minutes away. But I mean, like, this was in like what, the mid 2000s, like it couldn't have been much before, I don't know, 2010, right? Uber Eats exists. Yeah, the teacher could buy her something at the vending machine in school, and she could send money in tomorrow. There's probably food somewhere in the school. And Ruby was, on the video saying, I hope nobody gives her food so that she learned her lesson. She's 6. 6-year-olds are not going to learn lessons from being hungry. Maybe a 16-year-old, maybe you can say, okay, you forgot your lunch, it's on you, figure something out, because you're 16, you have resources. But a 6-year-old is not going to learn anything from hunger but that they feel very unsafe in school. That's all a 6-year-old is going to learn from hunger. But there seemed to be some glee in Ruby's voice when she was talking about her daughter being hungry that felt like an inner child who maybe felt taken advantage of as a child, lashing out. Like, don't you dare take advantage of me and make me drive 40 minutes to bring you food, right? There was some sort of that dynamic that I think we need to understand, not to condone it, but to understand it, because we can always slip down a path that we don't want to go down. So we want to understand it so that we can learn from it, not to condone it. And in fact, it's very much not condoned. The least condoning of human behavior is sending someone to prison for their behavior. So I do believe that both Ruby and Jodi will serve in prison, as they should. And I think for so many of our inner child, watching an abusive person be held accountable and be held to justice is very healing. It can be triggering, but it's also very healing to say, yeah, in the end, there's a judge who said, no, this wasn't okay. And that can be very validating. And I think one thing we can do from that is, many of us do not have the opportunity to take abusive people in our lives to court, right? Because many of us were abused in very subtle ways, or nobody's prosecuting, spankings from 25 years ago. But we can take those abusive people to court in our minds. And we can do what that judge did. We can say, you harmed a child. To me, harming a child is the most egregious thing an adult can do. So we can, in our brain, say, you failed in your duty as a human. Humans should protect children. You harmed a child. You were the adult. I was the child. You should not have done that. And we can sentence them to whatever amount of years in prison in our brain that we want to sentence them to. We can literally have that trial and empower our inner child and show our inner child, look, I'm holding that person accountable. Even if the world isn't, the world still thinks that narcissistic, abusive person is a wonderful person, but I've convicted them in my brain. I know. Inner child, I'm here. See, just like there's a judge out there who's holding Jodi and Ruby accountable, I can hold them accountable inside my own brain. And that can be very empowering for an inner child that's still cowering away, afraid of abuse. So I do think the outcome of this case is going to be very instructive. I think there's going to be hopefully a lot of things that come out of this case that will be beneficial for other families in the long run. I think that a lot of attention is now being paid to the impact of vlogging, the impact of YouTube, the impact of Instagram and TikTok on kids. And hopefully there will be some legislation in place to protect children. I don't think a channel should be monetized with children on it as unpaid labor. I think that they should at least be protected the way a child actor would be protected from a studio, right? There should be some regulations. Now that we saw this case, maybe that will happen. I think the Division of Child and Family Services, whatever it's called in Utah, needs to update their algorithms. Just because a family is educated, well-spoken, the home is immaculate, the children are dressed in, well-tended clothing, does not mean children aren't being abused there. So just because a family seems privileged and just because a family knows how to present themselves well to you does not mean that the kids aren't being abused. So let's update those algorithms a bit. I think that is another change. Perhaps tighter legislation on the mental health professional counseling profession and its ties to religion and the way Jodi operated her practice. That might also come to legislative attention. That would be a good thing too. So good things may come out of this case. Some very terrible and horrible things came out of this case. Children were abused, and that's never going to be okay. And I'm glad they were held to account for that. I will be posting more about this case as more information comes to light. At some point, I think we're all going to want to know about where was Kevin Franke in all of this, and does he bear any culpability, and what happens with that aspect of the case. I know they're getting divorced, but what happens with Kevin? How much did he know? And I think we also are going to hear more when the parole board actually hands down the number of years of the sentence. No matter what, it's going to be too little, because I just don't know how one ever fixes this terrible harm caused to vulnerable children in their care. I don't know that them going to jail for 1,000,000 years would ever make this up to the children. So I am going to be posting more about this. If you have any questions, if your inner child is really triggered by this case, if your inner child is feeling somewhat hopeful about this case, let me know in the comments below. Let me know what your open questions are about this case, and let me know what you're hoping the outcome will be. If you like this video, please subscribe. This is the kind of topic we talk about. We are post-traumatic parents. We get it. We've been there. We're post-traumatic parents too, and we do this together. Please check out the Post-Traumatic Parenting podcast, available wherever you get podcasts. And we have the Post-Traumatic Parenting community hangs out on Instagram. You can find us at Dr. Kozlowitz Psychology. And there's a lot of opportunities to interact. So if you wish this would have been a talk show and you could have talked more, that's where we do that. See you next time.